Hello everybody, my name is Full Armored Hell, and welcome to my channel. Today we will be looking at a tale of science gone too far, the shadow of otherworldly horrors beyond comprehension, and of a simple man in a not-so-simple situation. This is the Harbinger Experiment. So sit back, relax, and let us begin. The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, we naturally try and seek these things out. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we never could have imagined 100 years ago. We have defeated disease, built into the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us and what we have created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge has not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge, and in the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I do not say this from a standpoint of a great philosopher who has sat and simply pondered things, either. No. I say this because I have seen it, experienced it. I was part of it. The event I'm about to relay to you is true in its entirety. This I swear. I feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills. But I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is to simply warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain that it will happen again. In 1971, a not-so-well-known scientist began preparations for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger Experiment. I would like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this recording, I will refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear at best beyond 1971. All that is known about him before that time is that he had grown up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination of the occult and supernatural. This later made him an outcast amongst his fellow scientists due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was at the time. Zimmerman's opinions concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause for him being an outcast, though. It was his methods that made him widely unaccepted among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during his time for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He never cared about the means. All that mattered to him was the results. And if he predicted the results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was this insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him. And the few that knew of him, and did not fear him, believed in him and followed him in his work closely. The word Harbinger itself has such a mysterious and intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls from our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project, but the word always seems to carry a certain amount of doom with it. Which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reason for giving the experiment this title, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to a select few. He told us we were working on something big, and that he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he did not fully trust some of us, he did know we were professionals, and that for some reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but I was caught stealing medication and was promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume. The work was hard to find. I was also a native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while, while some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It's still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment. I would not be wholly surprised if his financing was not entirely legal. But legal or not, I needed the money, and he was paying. Looking back, it's a decision I have come to regret. After Zimmerman obtained his money, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. And upon that piece of land, Zimmerman built a concrete structure not dissimilar to a bunker. Its sole difference being that its goal was to keep any potential damage contained within its structure rather than keeping it out. Most of the structure dug underneath the earth, which had the effect of making the underground complex seem so much smaller than it really was from the outside. There was only one way of entering and leaving the underground structure, and it was via a ladder that led from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a large, thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff that Zimmerman had hired, myself included. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room. This is where all the facility's electronics and such were linked to. This included security cameras, lights, and door controls. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of his large central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as an infirmary, another door led to a break room, and the last door led into the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel rather eerie. They were, for some reason, laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to no complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the complex, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with the complex. But if you knew where you were going, you would find yourself standing before one of 3 8-by-8-foot rooms before very long. Each room had a camera hooked up to one of the corners of the room, and all 3 of those cameras were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to, when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance of each of the small rooms, and in order to open them, you would have to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived at the complex, how badly the hallways frightened me. I always have been claustrophobic, you see. Those hallways were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me in those bleak, narrow hallways. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel like you were trapped down there. Thankfully, though, I only rarely ventured into those hallways, for I was the only medical professional in the facility, and I had virtually no reason to go into them. In the beginning, I found it so peculiar that Zimmerman would ask for a medical professional like me on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger Experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on reports being sent out, at least, but, unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the project, excluding the subjects, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, Zimmerman had always had an obsession with the occult and supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who did not believe in him. He wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to obtain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger Experiment was to find proof of the metaphysical, a world we could not see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting, and even scary, but it was able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over to our world, and each of these beings would be trapped within one of 3 rooms. Zimmerman had the theory that any entity would try and latch onto the nearest living thing that had the capacity for it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with a compound mixture of Zimmerman's creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way it would be able to leave a host who had been injected from the compound was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession. And there is only one known species that possesses that amount of will required: humans. Zimmerman had also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and that there would only be one entity in each room, though I cannot say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I know next to nothing when it comes to how Zimmerman managed to do what he did. Zimmerman had also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and that there would only be one entity in each room, though I cannot say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I knew next to nothing when it comes to how Zimmerman managed to do what he did. He liked to keep his methodology a secret to even his most trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and take credit for his success. If I had known that this was the true purpose before I signed up, I may have reconsidered, but Zimmerman decided not to tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been allowed to do so. The security team Zimmerman had hired was loyal to him and the payout. It's not likely that Zimmerman had given them the order to now allow anyone to leave. There were 3 different subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless study of isolation, as I had mentioned before, which is why none of the subjects objected when they realized they would be confined to one of the 3 rooms mentioned earlier. The first subject was a young man. He was apparently out of work and desperately needed the money. The second was a woman, and by looking at her, it was apparent she was an addict of sorts. The third and final subject was an older man, a drifter if I had to guess. One thing they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left, which is exactly why they were chosen for the project. I'm sorry, I wish I could supply more information about the subjects, but all of this has been drawn from memory, and I was given little information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment did not officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin, so I packed up and headed out to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived at the compound a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a whole month before the project even began. I was not the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues, and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among the people Zimmerman did not trust to arrive first. Everyone had arrived about a week before the experiment began. There was a noticeable rift between those who were there simply for the money, like me, and those who were followers of Zimmerman. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms, the cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and all the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. Zimmerman asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all of his theories had been correct and he was not just a madman. He wanted us all to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone, and his voice was projected throughout all 3 rooms. He began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but Zimmerman could understand. We all observed the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their room dumbstruck by Zimmerman's chanting, staring into the monitors with confused expressions on their faces, waiting. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I cannot explain exactly what it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake subtly, and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong, while the subjects began dashing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then suddenly, the ground stopped shaking, and the monitor's image turned into nothing but static. The air became very heavy as we all stared into the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us exactly what was happening, or at the very least, the aftermath of what had already happened. For a while, all was silent but their screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain and terror began to echo throughout the compound. The similar screams of men began to coincide with the women's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were here for the money began to give each other scared looks, while those who were loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew deep down Zimmerman would never let that happen. We were here for the long haul. There was no escape. It was 10:13 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped. The monitors had yet to reveal to us what had occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screaming ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us all for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Not that any of us really wanted to come back. We solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins and settled in, reluctantly, for the night. I feel it's safe to say that not all of us slept very well, or even at all. I know I sure didn't. The following morning, all of the staff had arrived at the entrance building. We all stood inside, exchanging tired or nervous looks as we waited for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others did not seem to even be remotely affected by what had happened last night. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness as he came through the door on the entrance. He opened the hatch and, without any hesitation, began descending the ladder down into the black abyss. The giddiness in his voice was subtle, but even the darkness couldn't hide his smile. I was the first to follow behind Zimmerman's dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the farther I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. As I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that this place was different somehow. While before there was only the unsettling concrete walls and rooms, and now there was something else. Something that made the eeriness feel so real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there, but I continued climbing down despite my fear and hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malice in the air. A true evil lived here, and I could feel it. Looking at the faces of my peers, I could tell they could too. I finally felt my foot touch the ground and let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcome light. Zimmerman must have turned on the power. I allowed myself to take a couple seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it last night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing had even happened last night. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way towards the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by monitor 1 and 3, which were still pure static. It would have been a small relief, but the motionless image of monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was frozen into her gaunt face as she lay silent, lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He barked at the monitor be turned off immediately, and without even a second, it was off. Black. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images in the monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The security team nodded at hearing this, and they made it seem as though they had no fear. But you could see it, deep into their eyes. They were scared, all right. No, they were horrified. The only sound was a subtle tick-tock of a clock. An hour and 50 minutes had gone by, and the static was still all that occupied the monitors 1 and 3. All of the other staff members were working except for me. This was due to the fact that the project had gone completely injury-free thus far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for somebody to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues, and I were the only ones that occupied the room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side of the room while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I had clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of this. God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as monitor 3's image returned. The clear image now displayed on the screen made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid thing stood in the center of the room, unmoving and staring directly at the camera. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued, but this clearly was not the same man that had entered the room. What caught my attention first was its eyes. They were solid, black, and twice the size of a normal human's eyes. They seemed so endless and so cold. Its head had also grown with the eyes in such a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being had also shed all of the hair it once had, and even from the monitor, I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen in the fact that the jumpsuit was now obviously far too small for its wearer. Its limbs had grown especially long. Its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way a human.